Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada for Reason to Resist on June 11th, 2025. Today, we're very pleased to be joined again by John Helmer. John's the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia and the only Western journalist to direct his own bureau independent of single national or commercial ties. Born and educated in Australia, then at Harvard, John has also been a professor of political science, of sociology, and of journalism, and an advisor to governments in Greece, the United States, and Asia. Thank you very much for joining us again today, John.
Thanks for having me, Dimitri.
So, John, recently the destruction of two bridges in Western Russia led to the derailment of a passenger train heading to Moscow. The derailment reportedly killed and wounded hundreds of Russian civilians. Russia's government now alleges that agents of Ukraine are behind the destruction of these bridges. And when I say Ukraine, I'm referring, of course, to the Zelensky regime. Following the derailment, Russian President Vladimir Putin had some choice words. Let's listen to what he had to say.
They are asking for a summit meeting, but how can such meetings be held in these conditions? What is there to talk about? How can we negotiate with those who rely on terror?
So, John, as you have heard, and I'm sure you've seen this excerpt and the full statement before, there was a clear and unambiguous reference to terror. President Putin, up until now, his government, as I understand it, has treated this military intervention in Ukraine, the one that began in February 2022, as what it describes as a special military operation. And I remember at the beginning of this military intervention, many people in the West were taking umbrage with the use of that phrase. They alleged that, Russia's government was denying that they were involved in a war and so forth. But as I understand it, this is a phrase that has legal significance in Russia, and so too does the designation of Ukraine, the Zelensky regime, as a terrorist entity. Again, my understanding, I'm not a lawyer qualified to practice law in Russia, is that were this military intervention to be redesignated as a counter-terrorism operation under Russian law, this would give the Russian government significantly more latitude in terms of how it conducts these operations in Ukraine. Do you think, John, that Russia is now treating its military operations in Ukraine as a counterterrorism operation? And whether or not that's the case, what implications would it have if the Russian Federation were to take that step?
I think it's important to understand, as you pointed out, that some of the use of the word terrorism or terrorist act or terrorist organization, pardon me, is legalistic, but I don't believe it makes a significant difference to the General Staff's strategy, operational decision-making, or tactical decision-making. This is the context, as I understand it. In the first place, what accompanied those attacks on the railway bridge in Kursk and in Belgorod was a drone attack on the nuclear-armed or nuclear-capable bombers, the Tupolev bombers, in airfields, 5 airfields across the country. 2 struck aircraft, 3 failed. That has not been mentioned in the initial round of statements, but subsequently referred to as part of the Ukrainian terrorist operation. The reason for this is in part a smokescreen because of the strategic significance of the attack on the airfields. First, I'll come back to the railway bridge attacks in a minute. The strategic significance of attacking a part of the nuclear triad triggers Section 19C of the revised Russian nuclear deterrence doctrine, or white paper, which was issued last December. 19C says, roughly, and I've put it on a website, so if readers or listeners want to look at the exact words, that's where you'll find the exact words. 19C says that an attack by a non-nuclear state or an organization related to and controlled by such a state against the nuclear deterrence forces of Russia is an attack requiring, triggering the doctrine, which requires retaliation and an attempt by the Russian side. This isn't in the wording of the doctrine, but it's implied that Russia must regain escalation control to deter an adversary from attacking Russia's capability to match, deter, or destroy any nuclear attacker, such as the United States, France, Britain, or others. In other words, terrorism diminishes the strategic nature of that attack. At the same time, there is no mention of terrorism or Ukrainian-sponsored terror acts in the 33 terms tabled by the Russian government, by Vladimir Medinsky at Istanbul on June 2, the next day. Terrorism is not referred to there. Instead, one of the terms of the Russian end of war settlement requires, and I'm quoting roughly, a guarantee of the Ukraine to prevent any diversione, which is the Russian word. You can hear its Italian and Latin origin, for terrorism, sabotage, and subversion against the Russian Federation. That's if there was a doctrine of state terrorism, that's where you would expect to find it as one of the conditions that Ukraine must agree to for the future peaceful settlement between the two states and between Russia and those states behind the Ukraine, principally the United States and the NATO allies. Since terrorism isn't there, I believe it's reasonable to say terrorism is less important when talking about the nature of the attacks and the consequential retaliation or military action that would follow. That doesn't mean terrorism isn't important, but President Putin has defined terrorism as acts against civilians, right? Civilians, not military targets. The special military operation, in its military operations, both missile, drone, in the air and on the ground, are defined as against military targets which threaten Russia. It's called a special military operation because, as we began in February 2022, there were roughly speaking, 100,000 Russian forces moving against a well-fortified army, Ukrainian but guided by the United States and NATO, of up to 500,000. Up to 500,000. You don't conduct a war, a serious war, against 5. If you're attacking, the rules require you to have a 3-1 or 5-1 advantage over the defender. Otherwise, the defender will succeed. And to some extent, one has to say that the Ukrainian fortification and the Ukrainian counteroffensive has succeeded in slowing down and in some places stopping the Russian operation. But the Russian operation was intended to trigger a change of regime in Kiev that would then sign an agreement on the list of terms that were presented in early March in Istanbul 1, let's call it. Terrorism wasn't part of that negotiation either. But what does one call the Ukrainian attacks between 2014 and 2022 on the Donbass? Those attacks killed up to 14,000 Russian-speaking Ukrainians in what is properly termed a civil war, right? A civil war. But when the Ukrainian regime under Pyotr Poroshenko at the time moved to fight and destroy the resistance of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, what did he call that operation? What did NATO call that operation? The ATO, anti-terror or anti-terrorism operation. So the Ukrainians didn't want, the regime in Kiev didn't want to call the uprising in the Donbass and the loss of Crimea a civil war. They did not want to accept the legal structure that permitted Crimea to vote to leave and ultimately permitted Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson regions to vote to secede and join the Russian Federation. So the use of the term terrorism, when not applied to military action, was a smokescreen for Poroshenko then. It's partly a smokescreen now. But if one takes the simple definition that President Putin used following the June 1 attacks, terrorism is an act against civilians, that's clearly what happened in Kursk and Belgorod. So what do we call the Doolittle bombing raid of, when was that? April 18, 1942. That was 16 US bombers bombed Tokyo in retaliation for Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack on a military target. But the US bombing raid, which had 16 bombers, they more or less survived, but they did very little damage on the ground, was designed to show the Japanese military command what the US would ultimately be capable of in the war to come. It was a strategic operation designed, it hit civilians, but to make a strategic point. What do we call the bombing of Dresden, which happened in February 1945? That was when more than 1,200 bombers, English and American, bombed the civilians of Dresden. What do we call that? Is that a terrorism operation because it attacked civilians? Do we call it a military operation because Stalin at Yalta, because the Red Army commanders sought an Allied intervention to stop Germany moving forces from the west to the east to attack or counterattack the oncoming Russian advance? What do we call the firebombing of Tokyo, which happened, I think, March of 45, killed more than 100,000 civilians. The U.S. bombing team dropped napalm. They deliberately dropped incendiaries to kill civilians. There was no military. What are we talking about then? Mass state-sponsored terrorist bombing? No, we're not. We're talking about, and we can argue about the morality of those raids or the subsequent Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. We could talk about the morality, we could talk about the military function, we can talk about it many different ways, but those operations were deemed by our side and by the Red Army to be strategic, to have a strategic purpose. Now, why do I mention those? Because Russia's got to face this attack on the nuclear triad as a strategic assault. It's a strategic message from the United States and the NATO allies. Now, in the last day or two, and Monday, for example, Foreign Minister Lavrov described the attacks of the Sunday, June 1, as involving US intelligence and British intelligence 100%. But the line was, Lavrov said it, Putin has said it, many other officials have said it, they've played down the damage actually caused at the bomber airfields, played up the description that it was terrorist attack in order to, to provide a smokescreen while what's going to happen? That Russia is testing Trump. How far do you really want to take this battlefield war between Russia and the Ukraine into fully blown strategic warfare between the United States and its allies and Russia? That's a test for Trump. And so Russia is saying, we think he's sincere, we trust him. Well, that's a smokescreen too. What Russia is saying is, here's your opportunity, Mr. President. We're calling this terrorism. You can stop it because you control the Kiev regime. We've tabled 33 points for you to press them, including elections to replace Zelensky, to desist. So we're trying to say, do you want to encourage your clients, states, to escalate against us to the strategic level that was involved at the airfields? Or do you want to negotiate deterrence, escalation, de-escalation, and some form of peace settlement? In all of this, we have the term terrorism. Right. I don't believe anyone's going to redesignate the operation. For example, I've seen people say, by redesignating it counter-terrorism and designating the Ukrainian regime terrorist organization, that would permit a major decapitation strike. Well, what we know is that President Putin was asked by an ex-Israeli prime minister, acting as an intermediary for himself, promoting himself, and between Russia and others, to promise not to attack Zelensky.
I believe you're referring to Naftali Bennett.
Correct.
The war criminal, Naftali Bennett. Yeah. And this was an assurance that was given back in 2022, right?
Correct.
Right. Sorry,
it's not an assurance that's been reciprocal. Zelensky has made symbolic attack on the Kremlin by hitting the Senate dome inside the Kremlin. That was symbolic, but it was a way of saying, we can hit you, Mr. President. In addition, we've seen decapitation strikes by the Ukrainians against generals, including Kirillov, the general in command of chemical forces. And we see assassination attempts foiled all the time. So do we call this terrorism, acts of terrorism, or do we call them acts of war? The distinction is more apparent than real in operational terms.
Right. I just want to say, look, my understanding, and we talk a lot about this, largely incoherent concept of terrorism, which is infinitely manipulated by governments around the world, including and particularly the U.S. government, to serve their own political purposes. We talk about it a lot on Reason to Resist. And personally, I think we should just flush the word down the toilet and remove it whatsoever, entirely from not only the political discourse, but the legal discourse. There are laws in place which are more than sufficient to deter, attacks on civilians, violence against civilians. You don't need something called terrorism in the legal system in order to deal with that kind of violence. And it's just been used to eviscerate our civil liberties and justify all kinds of horrors. But whatever, that's a separate subject. I don't really want to go down that tangent now. I just want to comment in response to what you said that according to the conventional definition of terrorism that is generally used by Western governments, which is to say violence or threats of violence against civilians or civilian infrastructure for a political, ideological, religious purpose, something can be both terrorism, according to that definition, and be for a strategic purpose. So
Yes.
these are not mutually, I think you'll agree, these are not mutually exclusive concepts.
Yes.
All right. In any event, I just want to make that clarification, see if you agreed. What I'm particularly interested, having heard that, I think, quite fascinating explanation of what's going on here, is that when we last spoke, John, this I think was the day after the attacks on the strategic bombers by the Ukrainians,
Yes.
with almost certainly extensive assistance from the U.S. and the British. You predicted that we were going to see something you called the Orezhnik moment. And our audience won't know this, but very quickly after we had that discussion, you began to see indications, and you shared this with me, that in fact we weren't there yet. And your opinion began to evolve because of things that you saw. Now, some 8 days have gone by, and there has been no usage thus far of the Orezhniks, these hypersonic missiles, which are not only impossible by all indications for the West to shoot down, but also which use unique warheads and technology in order to inflict damage. We haven't seen that done since the
Right.
attack on the bombers. However, there does seem to have been rather extensive use made, and perhaps by the standards of the SMO, an extraordinary level of attacks with missiles and drones upon targets all around Ukraine.
Yes.
So, have you seen thus far during these 8 days? We haven't seen the Orezhnik, but have you seen what you regard as a remarkable, noticeable, significant change in the nature and or the extent of the attacks being inflicted upon Ukraine by the Russian military in the aftermath of these attacks? Or do you think we're seeing largely more of the same, maybe at a somewhat higher level of intensity, and that uh, you know the Russians, for the time being, are prepared to afford Trump an opportunity to bring the Zelensky regime to heel? How do you read what has happened on the ground militarily in Ukraine since the attacks on the strategic bombers?
Oh, I agree with you, but I better parcel out some of the points you made so we can discuss them, Dimitri. On the one hand, yes, there's been an escalation, to speak of it arithmetically, as more drones, more missile attacks and they've been sustained over a longer period of time, day by day. On the other hand, there has been no resumption of the electric war. That is, there's been no attempt to blanket the Western Ukraine with the kind of attacks we used to describe in past programs as electric war campaign, attempting to destroy the Ukrainian capacity to power everything, keep the lights on, run the sewage system, run the electric trains, and so forth. What is missing still, and remember, President Putin offered in the February telephone call with President Trump to suspend for 30 days attacks on energy infrastructure, which included the electric war campaign. The other side continued to attack energy infrastructure on the Russian side, refineries, pumping stations, including the pumping station of Kazakhstan oil, and the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. The other side, the Ukrainian side, assisted by US battlefield satellite, drone, and fixed wing aircraft intelligence gathering in the Black Sea, has continued to attack energy infrastructure. The Russian side suspended the electric war campaign. In this period, we haven't seen either significant attacks on railroads, particularly connecting Poland, which is the major supply hub, to Lvov and Kiev. No attempt to cut the railroad. No attempt to turn lights off in the West. If you want to bring the regime to a point where it can't escalate, it can't deliver its new arms to the front, it can't refresh its forces, it can't bring up anything to the east, you cut railroads, you cut roads, you cut electricity. But
So
that
why do you think Russia has refrained even now from doing that?
I don't know is the first answer I'd give. But let me go back a minute before I said I don't know.
Sure. Sorry to
no. To your general question. So, on the one hand, the military bulletin published each day by the Defense Ministry in Moscow does describe some of these missile drone attacks as retaliation for the terrorist attack, and they actually use that language. They want to tie it to the Kursk and Belgorod railway bridge, railway derailment acts. They don't mention the airfield attacks. So if you see what's happening as sending military and political messages, it's not sending the message Russia is now having a full-blown offensive to destroy the other side's capacity to escalate and the other side's reserves and capacities to fight. Not yet. And I guess our emphasis should be on the not yet part, the adverb. It's understandable in public opinion, in the general staff, in the military bloggers and commentators, Russian public influencers, that there should be an Oreshnik moment. There should be a strategic reply at the level of the state, which sponsored, directed, claimed credit for those attacks. Remember, the GRU, the Military Intelligence Agency, and the SBU, the security agency, took credit for, I think the SBU in particular took credit for the airfield attacks. The demand to accelerate the offensive westward by the Russian army on the ground, and the demand, public demand, general staff demand, informed opinion demand to go faster, to shorten the war, has been tempered by President Putin's calculation that there was a strategic interest in preserving Trump's apparent goodwill and regarding Trump's readiness to negotiate directly with Russia, which obviously the Biden administration had not been willing to do. So a lot of prediction started late last week that there would be a special Security Council meeting in Moscow this week, at which a new decision would be made how to respond strategically. That meeting took place yesterday, and it was covered by another smokescreen. On the one hand, the Security Council met. President Putin made some public remarks and announced that the agenda would be a discussion of how to preserve traditional Russian values. That was the smokescreen. It was presented publicly by the Kremlin, and there was no indication that Ukraine war, strategic response to Trump, the allies, or the Ukraine would be discussed. The evidence is that it was discussed behind closed doors, and I'm asking sources what was decided. Whether they'll tell me or not, I don't know right now. Too early. But what I can say is a very interesting message was signaled. The defense minister, Andrei Belousov, was wearing a military uniform. That's unusual. In fact, he hasn't worn a military uniform, and I checked, at a Security Council meeting this year at all. The last time I think I saw Belousov wearing a military uniform in Security Council was in mid-December. Not even before that. He was appointed last May 2024. Why would the defense minister get out of civvies and into a military uniform for this conversation about traditional Russian values? It's a signal. It's a signal that there was to be a military discussion after the doors closed on the overt public version of what they were discussing. Mm-hmm. But my sources say, and therefore I'm simply saying what I believe to be true from those in a position to know, that Russia is not in a hurry to demonstrate either an Oreshnik moment or any other form of escalation until such time as President Trump demonstrates whether he wants to turn off the Ukrainian war or delegate it to the Europeans, buying their weapons from the United States and delivering them, including US intelligence, to the continuation of the war. There are escalation options on the Ukrainian side. We've seen Merz, and Chancellor of Germany, has the option now and has discussed publicly delivering Taurus missiles guided by, operated by, fueled by German crews with satellite intelligence and battlefield intelligence supplied by the United States. That's one escalation. A second escalation was the one demonstrated at the airfields. It's a signal that they could go elsewhere against the seaborne leg of the triad or against silos. I mean, there are a variety of things they could do, and they're signaling that with US Anglo-American support, they might try to demonstrate this. Then there's the Golden Dome that Trump announced to a great self-promotion, a hugely expensive operation claiming to put defensive weapons in space to protect the United States from any first strike or nuclear attack by anyone. Now, that's highly destabilizing, and Russian officials say so. In fact, they say there's a combination of nuclear war-headed escalation in Germany on top of the nuclear-capable batteries the US has installed in Romania and Poland already, plus destabilizing fielding, if that's the correct word, of space weapons by the United States. These are highly destabilizing strategic initiatives Trump's in favor of. Well, says the Security Council, representing all of the armed forces, security services, foreign ministry, intelligence services, and President Putin himself, we can't afford to go too quickly before it's very much clearer what's to be trusted in Trump. Okay. That's why it's worth talking about what Trump's doing in Los Angeles, and what he does with respect to China in London the last couple of days. Does what he is threatening to do to Iran on the basis of no enrichment, and so on and so on and so on.
So one way that we can gauge what Trump's intentions are is the press conference that Trump gave when Germany's chancellor, whom I affectionately refer to as Chancellor BlackRock, otherwise known as Frederick Merz, visited Washington. And I'd like to show you an excerpt from that press conference in which Trump is asked about Russia and being harder on Russia, with Merz sitting next to him. Now, this is a little bit long, this excerpt, so I'm going to play it at a higher speed, but not so quickly that you'll have trouble understanding it. So here's the part that I think is probably most pertinent.
Mr. President, so would you consider to put more sanctions on Russia? Because this discussion is going on now for weeks and months, and you tweeted about it once, but then nothing happens.
Yeah, when I see the moment when we're not going to make a deal, when this thing won't stop, at that moment, yeah, it's in my brain, the deadline. When I see the moment where it's not going to stop, and I'm sure you're going to do the same thing, will be very, very, very tough. And it could be on both countries, to be honest. You know, it takes two to tango. But we're going to be very tough, whether it's Russia or anybody else. We're going to be very tough. That's a bloodbath that's going on over there. And when I see the moment where I say, well, they're going to just keep fighting. You know, I gave the analogy yesterday when I spoke to President Putin. I had a 2-hour and 15-minute call with him. Sometimes, and this is me speaking maybe in a negative sense, but sometimes you see two young children fighting like crazy. They hate each other and they're fighting in a park. And you try and pull them apart. They don't want to be pulled. Sometimes you're better off letting them fight for a while and then pulling them apart. And I gave that analogy to Putin yesterday. I said, President, maybe you're going to have to keep fighting and suffering a lot because both sides are suffering before you pull them apart, before they're able to be pulled apart. But it's a pretty known analogy. You have two kids, they fight. Sometimes you let them fight for a little while. You see it in hockey. You see it in sports. The referees let them go for a couple of seconds, let them go for a little while before you pull them apart. And maybe, and I said it, and maybe that's a negative because we're saying go, but a lot of bad blood. There's some bad blood between the two. I have to deal with it, and the chancellor has to deal with it. It's incredible. There's a great hatred between those two men, but between the warring parties, great hatred.
So, John, where does one even begin with this excerpt?
Yes, where do you begin?
I mean, I'd like your thoughts about two things here, John. First is, what do you think about this analogy that the so-called president of the United States used, comparing the war in Ukraine to two children having a fight in the schoolyard? But the more important question is, did you get any sense from that response to this question about how he's going to be tougher on Russia, or quite apart from this press conference, have you seen anything from Trump since the attack on the Russian nuclear bombers, which suggests that he's now changed and he's going to really rein in Zelensky, and he's going to rein in the European governments who seem hell-bent on escalating this war? Did you see any exchange there or otherwise? And secondarily, what do you think about this analogy he employed?
Well, just the analogy. He thinks that he's the adult that will pull apart the children. That's quite interesting psychologically, because he had such a grim childhood himself, favored by his father to attack his own brother. Trump's family history is one of Trump allying with his own father to seriously damage his older brother, who became alcoholic, died early. Trump, I'll skip for the audience the psychoanalysis of all of this, but it's obvious Trump thinks he's the adult in the room that can pull apart two children. Now, he's not the only adult in the room. By nuclear warhead standards, there are several adults in the room, none of whom, under the prevailing strategic doctrine, dares to attack the other because the retaliation would destroy them all. Trump, however, thinks, and this is the very serious issue to be tested, that he can bluff, threaten, or otherwise use force in such a way as to prevail beyond the mutual assured destruction balance, the strategic balance between nuclear armed adults. He thinks he pulled apart India and Pakistan at a nuclear moment. He said so in that particular press conference, but he's repeated it. And the man endlessly repeats a few conceptual formula, which he produces in the form of slogans to remind himself of what he thinks. He thinks he pulled apart India and Pakistan. That's not what happened, but without straining our audience's interest in that war, they were nuclear partners. Pakistan was getting ready to escalate up the nuclear ladder, and India destroyed by air and missile attack its command control, its air defenses, and in particular the Sargodha air base where the nuclear weapons were stored. And at that point, Pakistan applied to Vance for a ceasefire arrangement, which was then referred down to the military level, and we can skip the rest of the story. Trump claims credit for pulling those two children apart. That's not what happened, but he thinks so. If he thinks so, that's a very important element for Russia to consider. On the one hand, Russia, the Russian government, including President Putin, regards Trump as an opportunity that wasn't there with the Biden gang, and that's a positive. Therefore, they must continue to probe how positive is this. First, second, if you have an adversary like Trump, he's far more predictable. I know he's referred to as mercurial and this and that, but from a Russian point of view, from our point of view, and I think from your point of view, Trump's very much more predictable than Biden was. Why? Because Biden was in dementia. He was in Parkinson's, late stage of Parkinson's disease, and a few other things that were hidden. But we knew that they were being hidden. We knew that it was Blinken, Sullivan, Newland, and some others who were running the show. And it was, while their Russia-hating, Slav-hating, race-hating motivations were clear, they were a more unpredictable enemy than Trump. So what Trump is doing, sometimes referred to as transactional, sometimes referred to as some form of business tactic. It's a very simple version of showing power, the adult versus the children, which will cause fear, trembling, shock, and awe, so that the children can be pulled apart, and you, the adult, will emerge the victor. I think that roughly describes the model. Add to the fact that Trump doesn't really want to make war. He wants to make money. But if war's on, he'll make money at that too. So making money at demonstrating military and political power is what he does. And he loves military power. He's going to turn on a military parade in Washington very shortly and threaten to sort of shoot anybody who demonstrates on Pennsylvania Avenue against it. He adores the display of military power, and he believes that he's got the most powerful army in the world etc., etc. A slogan he uses often. But when confronted with Joint Chiefs of Staff assessments that, Mr. President, you can't attack Iran without facing more serious consequences than you may have anticipated, he stops and retreats. When confronted with a minor set of demonstrations in Los Angeles, he sent in violation of just about every law on the books, including the US Constitution, 5,000 men, which will be tested, its legality, in court on Thursday. But before then, before there's an injunction, if there's an injunction against this, he will have declared victory. He's already declared victory over the insurrectionists, the terrorists, blah, 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 in Los Angeles. And he'll withdraw the forces and claim he's defeated the Democratic frontrunner for the presidency in 2028. And that's his purpose. So I think there's a more serious purpose in all of the performative aspects of Trump's tweeting, those Oval Office press conferences, and the way the questions are planted. He can't cope with impromptu, free Q&As, and he doesn't answer when he's confronted by one. He repeats slogans. This war wouldn't have started if I'd been president, etc., etc. But the serious aspect is the game he's playing. And he's the child that has to be pulled apart. And the Russian attitude is, yes, there's a big opportunity here to pull him apart from Starmer, whom he doesn't like, and who's running a 40% gap between disapproval and approval, between Macron, whose disapproval rating's even worse than Starmer's, and with a bunch of political leaders in Europe, including Maloney, the Dutch, the Poles, and so on, and the Finns, who are weak politically and domestically. And Trump's, from a Russian point of view, there's a strategic opportunity to pull NATO apart. It's a bit early to say it's coming crashing down. Podcasters can sell audiences on such dramatizations. That is much too early. But from Russian point of view, the Russian side needs time for Trump to demonstrate his schoolyard power, and then what he does when he meets an adult. What does US force do when it meets Russian force? Really? Answer. It finds proxies to test, and that's what's happening. So the Russian side has to figure, okay, then either you control your proxy, or we call this entire negotiation a failure. And that's what we're about at the moment.
Right. This is all this talk about sanctions, and I realize, there's a lot of appetite in the United States Senate for ever more sanctions against Russia.
Yes.
Although, on what grounds they think that they can bring Russia to heel with more sanctions, it escapes me utterly. And maybe Trump is just playing to that the sentiment in the Senate and elsewhere in the U.S. political elite, when he says in response to this question with Mertz beside him, it's going to be really ugly. We're going to put huge sanctions on Russia if they don't play ball and so forth. But whether he's playing to the Republican, neocons or not, that certainly didn't sound to me like he's going to, either get the United States entirely out of this war, stop funding it, stop providing military equipment and so forth, or even more so, impose a solution upon Zelensky, whose regime is existentially dependent upon the United States. I have seen no indication of that so far since the attack on the nuclear bombers. Have you seen any indication?
No, there's none. And let's remember, I agree entirely with you, Dimitri. There's no sign of that. And there's no sign, for example, that any of the terms that Russia tabled on June 2 in Istanbul are comprehended and acceptable to Trump. No sign yet. For example, one of the terms is new elections. New elections in the Ukraine, replacement of Zelensky. That's one term, but there's been no suggestion from Trump that he favors, let's call it democracy in the Ukraine. No. What he does is one day they go through a stage of you aren't grateful enough to us, you little boy. We gave you all those ice creams, and now look what you're doing. You're not saying thank you to our adult Vance and Trump and thank you for all we've done for you. Well, we're going to tell you what we're going to do. So we're going to make money and we're going to send in inspectors, blah, 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 blah. On the other hand, he then has this beautiful two-chair display of amity in St. Peter's Basilica. I mean, during the ceremonies for the Pope's funeral to demonstrate how well he is with Zelensky. And then one day he says he's a tough guy and he doesn't like him, and another day he embraces him. It's difficult to tell who's the child here, but the psychology is the same. It's essentially not serious, militarily speaking, strategically speaking. It's serious for Trump to demonstrate political power to his base. He is running an earlier disapproval rating than Biden or any of the predecessors, or even Trump in his first term. Trump sees votes and money to be the same things. He aims to make money, whatever happens, and convert that into power, whatever happens. So that's a kind of opportunism that is exploitable from a Russian point of view to achieve a peace in Europe. But there's no mistaking the strategic alignment with Merz, the fascist, the 25.5% Führer of Germany. That's how big his vote was. That puts him in charge of the coalition, a weak coalition in Germany, and suppresses the bigger vote getter, the Alliance for Germany, the AfD, as if it's terrorist, fascist, and so on. But Trump, in that meeting, apologized for D-Day to the German. That was an incredible thing. You must have had an uncomfortable day, says Trump after Merz says tomorrow will be the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Yes, it must have been uncomfortable. I'm sorry about that. I mean, that was bad enough from anyone's point of view. But Trump says that America won that war with that operation. This is ridiculous, but it's serious. It's a serious calculation of where the votes and the money lie ahead. Trump is always seeing the jackpot pouring out of the money machine if he pulls the handle hard enough. That's what he's doing. And from a Russian point of view, he's dangerous but predictable. And from a Russian point of view, let's see how far he will go towards the 33 terms. And we'll wait. Meanwhile, we will accelerate our movement westward. We will increase the pressure and show we are still, Russia was always said by NATO to be running out of drones, running out of missiles, running out of aircraft, etc. Well, Putin doesn't want a war mobilization in the Russian economy. That would have the effect of increasing state power at the expense of his oligarch constituency. He too has votes and money to take care of. that's Russian domestic politics, but it's not irrelevant in these issues. So each side's testing each other in a way that was impossible during Biden, Blinken, and Sullivan time. That's a positive. But I can't accept those podcasters and analysts who see more of a silver lining in these clouds. Trump specializes in pulling the silver out of the clouds, and Russia's prepared to bribe him.
Yeah. I want to say one thing before we end our conversation today, John, about the way Trump is discussed in the alternative anti-imperialist media. And then I just want to make two clarifications. I'll elaborate in a moment. To my mind, when we talk about Donald Trump, and I've said this repeatedly, if you're going to try to predict where Trump is going, look at his record. His rhetoric is much less important than the actual policies that he adopted and implemented in his first administration, so far in his second administration. And those policies and actions point unambiguously in the direction of war and militarism and imperialism. But that's my view. Nonetheless, a lot of people in the alternative media, including some people I respect, and people who are experienced geopolitical analysts, people with military experience at a high level from the West, tend to give Trump the benefit of the doubt. And, for example, when it comes to this attack on these nuclear bombers, they lend credence to the idea that Trump didn't know. Or, one commentator, I'm not going to, out of respect for him, I'm not going to identify him because generally I do like his analysis. He said, I think what happened was that, Trump's advisors went into the room and said, look, something big is going to happen in Russia and it's going to change the course of the negotiations, but it's better that you not know the details. And Trump basically was content with that. Where he gets this, I don't know. But my own view, as I've said repeatedly, is I think Trump knew the details. I think he made a conscious decision to actually support this extraordinary escalation. Yes. But the really thing I want to say is when you talk about Trump, if you are genuine anti-imperialist, not only do you look at the man's record and you're thinking rationally, objectively, not only do you put the focus on the man's record and put much less weight on his rhetoric, but you would also start by noting that he is currently facilitating in every imaginable way a genocide in Gaza. He is a genocidal war criminal, and it astonishes me how often people who actually acknowledge that there's a genocide happening in Gaza, who condemn the genocide in Gaza, who know that the United States is playing a key role in that, simply ignore this extraordinarily important piece of information when they talk about Donald Trump and are giving him the benefit of the doubt when it comes to things like war and peace. I just find that amazing. And I'm going to allow you to comment on that. But before I do, I'm going to invite you to comment on that. I just want to make two clarifications. When you said 25.5% about the Fuhrer, I totally agree with your assessment about Mertz. I take it what you meant was he actually got 28.5% of the vote, but there was an 82% turnout. And so he got something like 25.
No, you're right about. I've seen the 28.5. So I went to the German Election Commission, I've forgotten what it's called, to look up exactly what each of the parties in the ruling coalition got as a vote. And I read 25.5% for the CDU. I don't know where the 28.5 comes from. I was using it myself, but between 25.5 and 28.5, we're looking at a puny, a mini Führer. Hitler won the chancellorship with 44%. I mean, really, that's you're right to pull me up on that, and I can't explain the difference between 25.5 and 28.5. But the fact is, he's a minority chancellor with less vote mandate than Scholz had.
Right. And I just want to, actually, I wasn't trying to pull you up, and I just wanted to point out that the turnout was 82.5% in the German election. So the percentage of eligible votes that he got was actually substantially below 28.5, even if that is the correct number of people
Yes.
percentage of. So I haven't done the math, but it's probably something like 22 or 23%, maybe 24% of
Yes.
eligible voters. So that you're absolutely right, and remarkably, Trump is in that. I think he said in that press conference, that he's got Mertz has a strong mandate. He's
Yes, he did exactly that. That was his language.
right.
And
But
that tells you not that he's stupid, but that's the prompt line he's got in his prompt cards. Remember, Biden used to pull out the prompt cards. Trump doesn't have to. You can hear him recite the prompt cards as they come out. Strong mandate? No, that means the reverse. Merz has a very weak mandate. Yes.
Right. And the other clarification I want to make, and then I'm done talking, is this is, I think, the second or third time when you've commented on what happened in the recent war, if I suppose one could call it a war, between India and Pakistan. And on the prior occasions when you've commented on that and expressed the view that India delivered a considerable defeat to Pakistan, we got a lot of irate
I know.
people who are regular watchers of our show and generally like our program, and they disagree. So I just want to say we've had on Reason to Resist Aman Tariq, who is the host of the Eon podcast in Pakistan. You can find his interview there, and he of course expressed a very different perspective on this. His understanding, based on the information available to him, was that India was humiliated. So on Reason to Resist, we don't purport to know what actually happened. There are conflicting views about this. I just want people to say, John is an extremely accomplished journalist. I'm sure he's done his homework, but there is another view out there which we have covered on Reason to Resist. I just want you to know, when it comes to the question of who won that, we are agnostic at Reason to Resist. But please go ahead, John, and feel free to comment on anything.
No. Look, it's fair enough, and just take a couple of minutes just to say that I used to be the Russia correspondent for Viewpoint of Lahore. I've had lots of contact over the years with Pakistan, much less in India, and much more in Sri Lanka, where I was the advisor of the Prime Minister for a while. But I'm not what those commenters want to say on this issue, or in my head, or culturally, pro-Indian. I don't have a particular ideological grudge, let's say, or an orientation. I believe the facts to be the facts, but we aren't going to talk about that war. And so I'll just finish by saying, if you just look at me, I'm not a propagandist for an Indian line. I believe the data show what they show, but I've just used it as an example, not of what exactly happened, but what didn't happen that Trump claims credit for, that he thinks. Okay, that's one thing. The more important thing you said, Dimitri, you said a lot of important things, and I'm not being derogatory, but let's get to what, on the line of the empire. You used the word empire, and I'm beginning to see many more of the American podcasters who wouldn't be considered to have been anti-imperialist for their early career when they were in the uniformed services, speak of the empire. And the empire is, and you've heard me say this before, has been planning to destroy Russia since 1917. Okay, and before that, it was the British Empire trying to curtail the Russian Empire, and on we can go. But we won't go further back in time. But the problem right now, from a Russian point of view, is not only must there be escalation control against the Ukraine, which you can either achieve by destroying their capacities militarily till they are at capitulation, or you can deter the empire from supporting that platform and that battlefield. Fighting for Russia to fight the empire, it's not ready. It's not ready to fight such a war. Its army has to be rebuilt. Its forces, its technology, all of that has to be done at a cost the country can afford. And why not try to work out, let's call it a détente, let's call it a diversion, let's call it a deflection of empire war making, so that Russia has a breathing space, and not simply until the end of June when the next Istanbul round comes up, for the next 5 to 10 years. And that means the ability to deter military action along the northern front, up to the Arctic and across to the Far East. So you won't hear President Putin articulate a clear anti-imperialist line, but it's there.
All right. Thank you very much for those thoughts. Much appreciated. Very important. So we're going to leave it there, and we'll be certainly looking forward to our next conversation with John Helmer. I'm sure the way this existentially dangerous war is unfolding, we'll have a lot to talk about in the days ahead. So
thank you, Dimitri. Thanks.
And we're signing off for now. I'm in Montreal, Canada on June 11th, 2025.